Good morning. Well, it's time to start. There are not so many people, only 24, but let's say that, well, on Sunday, it's not too bad, and I hope that they are going to join us. Okay. So usual questions. Do you hear me? Do you see me? Is everything okay for you? Hi. Yeah, thank you. To you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I know it's Easter, but anyway, we're going to talk about financial intermediaries. Okay, let's start and let me use the slides. Okay. Okay. So yesterday we started already this this part of the lecture. So we're gonna study now the coexistence between direct financing and intermediated financing, because this is typically the case in real life. As I told you yesterday, and as you are well aware of, um, firms can use as a source of financing either direct financing like IPO or issuing bonds, or credit from bank, that is intermediated financing, and either one or the other or both of them. Okay, so that is what we are going to be interested in to start with this morning. Is that clear? Do you have question maybe about yesterday, about I don't know? What time is it in Vietnam? What time is it? 2 p.m. Okay. So after lunch break. Am I correct? Okay, I see. Great. Great. Okay. So what about this question of coexistence between direct financing and intermediated financing? Um, well, this is what we are going to see now. And we're going to find some explanations of why actually it is the case. I mean, why there are both intermediated and direct financing in the economy. So I talked already about the question of effort. Well, here, basically, effort is associated to what we called yesterday good behavior. But as I told you already yesterday, when we talk about effort, well, it's not you don't have to be exhausted at the end of the day. It's not the question. And sweating all around. It's not the question. It is a metaphor. Okay. But you can think that effort in some extent is associated to having a good behavior. Okay, so of course, in our case, it is related to the behavior of an entrepreneur because this is what we are interested in. And that guy chooses the allocation of the firm's resources between different types of securities. Let's say benefits which are going to be obtained by the firm's claim holders, like equity holders, bond holders, and so on and so forth. And so on and so forth, on or to private benefit. We talked already about private benefit yesterday. And the point with the private benefit is that it's not transferable. Okay, this is something which is not transferable. This is why we talk about private benefit. So I repeat, this is not transferable to outside investor. And here we consider that there is a cost which is associated to exerting the effort. But remember what we saw yesterday. So yesterday, for instance, we brought down the incentive compatibility the constraint of the entrepreneur. It was something like PHV minus R lender higher than the L V minus R lenders plus B, so the private benefit. But of course, it is just equivalent to write, so this is 100% equivalent to writing minus B and as we said yesterday, if you write this like this, B can be interpreted as an opportunity cost and in our case we're going to say that if you exert the effort it is costly and in some extent it is like writing PHV minus R lenders minus the cost of effort which should be higher than PLV minus R lenders. And you see that either this expression, which I'm going to call 1, and that expression, which I'm going to call 2, 1, of course, is equivalent to 2. So there are two ways of talking about this question of moral hazard. Either one possibility is to say that In case of bad behavior, the entrepreneur receives a private benefit. And the other equivalent possibility is to say that in case of good behavior, the entrepreneur pays or bears a cost of effort. That one. Okay, so the two presentations are just equivalent. Okay, there is nothing new in the fact of talking about a cost of effort. So C of E is the cost of effort. Just one remark. So if you look at the models of moral hazard, there are two kinds of model. One in which it is a discrete choice. So either effort or no effort. No effort. So in that case, effort, you have a fixed cost associated with exerting the effort, and no cost, of course, the cost is equal to 0. Or the other possibility is to consider a continuous choice. That is, the effort belongs to R plus. In that case, you have a function of the effort which is increasing and convex. But what we are going to do in this lecture, it is just to consider the discrete choice presentation, which is, of course, much simpler. Much simpler, excuse me. Okay, and here, so this is important to understand because this is how we talk about effort versus private benefit. Were private benefit efficient, it would not be private benefit because this is not our definition. In our case, everything which is inefficient and not transferable is associated to private benefit. If it is not transferable but efficient, this is not private benefit. This is a question of definition. Okay? And of course, effort is efficient. But once again, this is per se, because this is how we define effort. So it cannot be different. If exerted an effort would be inefficient, well, this is not what we call effort. Okay? So there are examples here. I talked already about this example yesterday, but just let me repeat. Once again, if building an empire if building an empire allows to maximize returns, it's not a problem. But most of the case, it's not. So if building an empire is not the best way to maximize returns, then it is associated to private benefit. Okay. Sustained family control. It is the same. I mean, if trying to impose your son or your daughter as the next CEO of the firm, if she or he is very well talented, it's not a problem. But if she or he is not very talented, then it becomes a private benefit. Okay, and of course investing in perks, pet projects, and so on and so forth. Is that clear so far? No questions so far? Really? Okay. So basically, we are going to consider a model of credit market with moral hazard. So this is something that we are already well aware of because we saw it yesterday. And basically, we're going to take the same model. And by the way, if you want to have more explanations about that, you can look at the book of Jean Tirole, The Theory of Corporate Finance, on page 115. And there is the presentation of a simple model of credit rationing and the role of net worth, which is basically something that we're going to see now. Okay, so there are entrepreneurs. They each want to realize a project. Each project necessitates an investment equals to capital I. And the project, once again, it is a binomial result, either a success or a failure. So in case of success, the return is V. In case of failure, the return is 0. Each entrepreneur faces a problem of moral hazard in the sense that, let's say, we can associate, for instance, the good behavior to the good choice of a technology. And the choice of technology, of course, is going to affect the probability of success of the project. So let's say this is a good behavior. Okay. So if the good technology is chosen, the probability of success, exactly as yesterday, it is pH. But if, so this is bad behavior. But if a bad technology is chosen, then probability of success is PL. And of course, pH is greater than PL. But in that case, same presentation as yesterday, the entrepreneur obtains a private benefit. And the amount, the equivalent wealth amount associated to the private benefit is capital B. Okay, and we make the same assumptions as yesterday. That is, if the entrepreneur chooses the good technology, the NPV of the project is positive. But if the entrepreneur prefers to choose the bad technology, well, the NPV is necessarily negative. So you remember that the NPV is only PLV minus capital I, but this is necessarily negative because we have that PLV plus B, which is not transferable, minus I, which is already negative. So this implies that the NPV is necessarily negative. So by the way, you could be thinking that there is something which is wrong when we compute the NPV, because you've got, in terms of timing, t equals 0, t equals 1. There we have the investment, and in that case, return v are 0. So you should use an account a rate in order to a discount rate to find the equivalent value of v at t equals 0. But here, to simplify, we consider that the discount rate is just 0, equals 0, right? So the NPV, if there is good behavior, for instance, which is PHV over 1 plus the discount rate minus capital A, but since this is equal to 0, it is just PHV minus capital I. Okay. Okay. Yes. Another point to explain is that because of these two assumptions, a financial, or let's say a financing contract is only possible if the entrepreneur behaves well. Okay, as investors prefer not to invest in this project because they know that the project is going to destroy wealth and not to create wealth. Okay, and they won't be able to break even. Another point which is important is to say that so you remember the question associated with the problem of moral hazard. It is, I don't know what you are doing. So this means that the technological choice is not observable outside the firm. So in other words, the entrepreneur knows for sure what the technological choice is, but not the outside investors. Okay. Okay. So what about direct financing? Well, actually, this is something that we know quite well. So first of all, assumption, the entrepreneur is protected by the limited liability. So this implies that in case of failure, the return to investors, outside investors, is 0, just equal to 0. And let's say R is what we denoted yesterday, R lenders, and it represents what investors obtain in case of success of the project. Okay. Limited liability. So now we want to write down the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur. And actually, the incentive compatibility constraint is just saying that the expected gains of the entrepreneur if good behavior should be higher. It's just comparing the expected gains in case of good or bad behavior, and to put the inequality in this direction, of course. If bad behavior. Okay, this is the incentive compatibility constraint. It's just that the entrepreneur is going to choose to behave well if his expected gains in that case are higher than the expected gains if he or she chooses to behave badly. Okay, so this is very easy to write. I mean, so for the entrepreneur, the project is just V minus R or 0. And the behavior of the entrepreneur is going to affect the probability of success. So in that case, we are going to obtain this plus, and it should be higher than PLV minus R, but don't forget the private benefit. Okay, and once again, we obtain the same result as yesterday because this is basically the same thing, which is to say that repayment should be lower than a maximum repayment to lenders, which is equal to V minus B over PH minus PL. So remember, in case of success, if you want the entrepreneur to behave well, you cannot repay everything to lenders. Because in that case, you see that I told you already that if R is equal to 0 or close to 0, well, you see that for the entrepreneur, it is going to be close to 0. So in that case, maximizing, well, in that case, a success or a failure for the entrepreneur is just equivalent. It is the same, basically. So it's not possible to induce him to prefer behaving well. And he will necessarily choose to pick up the private benefit. So in order to induce the entrepreneur to prefer behaving well, the return for him should be high enough in case of success compared to the return in case of failure, in such a way that he or she prefers to maximize the probability of success rather than just taking the private benefit. Okay. Okay. So let's say the possibility. So we know that with PL, in that case, obtaining financing is not possible because if bad behavior NPV negative. So even if you give everything to the lenders in case of success, well, PLV is lower than capital I, and therefore participation constraint of the lenders cannot be satisfied. Okay, but so the maximal pledgeable amount which can be obtained by the outside investors is R max. And by the way, we call PH V minus B over PH minus PL. So this has a name which is called pledgeable income. Okay, this is how it is called. This is the maximal expected amount that outside investors can obtain in such a way that the entrepreneur prefers to behave well. Okay, pledgeable income. And so investors accept to finance project if and only if pledgeable income is greater than capital I. And this is called, we know how it is called because we saw it yesterday. It is the participation constraint of the investors, outside investors. Okay, so I repeat. So this is also the participation constraint of the investors. So in our case, it is okay. Okay. Is that clear so far? What is pi r plus? What do we mean? Sorry. Where is this notation? Pi r plus. Sorry, I don't understand your question. In the continuous case. Okay, great. R plus is a real number. So E belongs to R plus means E is a positive real number. Effort is a positive real number if effort is continuous. But we're not going to talk about that. It was just to tell you that this is something which exists, but we're not going to go into the details of that case, which is a little bit more complicated. Okay? Okay. Okay, so now, so what about intermediated financing? So you remember choice of technology is not directly servable by outside investors. So if there is direct financing, they don't know what the choice of technology is. So what about intermediated financing? Well, in that case, we consider, and this is credible, that let's say a bank, for instance, a financial intermediary is able to deduce, to observe the choice of technology by realizing a kind of audit. So let's say a bank, by realizing an audit, is able to observe the technological choice of the entrepreneur. Okay, so very well, but of course the audit is costly. I say of course because if the audit is free, well, it's not interesting to to look at that case. If the audit is free, the audit is always going to be realized, and there is no problem of moral hazard whatsoever. So it is a little bit more tricky if the audit is costly, because let's say that RB is the repayment to a bank in case of success of the project. Why only in case of success? Still because the entrepreneur is protected by the limited liability. So in that case, you have RB, which should be lower than R, not R, sorry, V. V, return of the project. So the full return of the project. So this is due to limited liability, and else just zero due to limited liability. Okay, so a bank invests if and only if this participation constraint, so this is the bank participation constraint. But there is one huge difference between intermediated financing and direct financing. It's that in our case, by realizing an audit, the bank observes the technological choice. So there is no longer any question of incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur. So in some extent, by realizing the audit, the bank is able to impose choice of the good technology. So now we can have RB equal to V. This could be possible. Why? Because there is no longer an incentive compatibility constraint to satisfy. So by realizing the audit, the bank obliges, forces, imposes the choice of the good technology to the entrepreneur. So you see that the participation constraint on the entrepreneur now becomes PHV, which should be higher than capital I investment plus the cost of audit. Okay, because this is costly, the bank is going to pay for the audit, and therefore the bank is going to, in some extent, make indirectly the entrepreneur pays for the audit cost. Otherwise, the bank would have a negative profit and would not be willing to grant the credit to the entrepreneur. Okay, so you see that there are two aspects associated with intermediated financing. On the one hand, it allows to impose the choice of the good technology, the good behavior to the entrepreneur, which is good news. But on the other hand, it is more costly. The cost is higher due to the cost of audit compared to direct financing. Okay, so you see that would direct financing be possible for the entrepreneur? What would she choose? Direct financing or intermediated financing? What do you think? Yes, direct, of course, direct. Why? Because intermediated financing is more costly. The entrepreneur indirectly pays for the cost of audit. Exact. Extra audit cost. Okay. That is what you have to understand. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So you remember that what we are interested in, it is the coexistence between direct financing and intermediated financing. Well, we've got an explanation, because consider that pH V minus B over pH minus PL is lower than capital I. So direct financing is not possible. But maybe pHV is greater than I plus C. So in that case, intermediated financing is possible. Okay, so firms which can access direct financing are going to choose direct financing. But those which cannot access direct financing, if intermediated financing is possible, well, they are going to choose intermediated financing. Okay, so they are going to choose intermediated financing, so firms. So there is a clear preference for firms. So first, direct financing, and second, intermediated financing. Why? Because it is more expensive. But even if it is more expensive, it is better than just nothing. Okay. So if you compare this to equations, it's not possible to distinguish between two firms, because all the things are the same. Okay, so now I think that we understand clearly preferences between either direct financing, which is cheaper, or intermediated financing, which is more expensive. But what we want to understand is the coexistence between the two. And in order to do that, we should introduce, so basically this slide corresponds to what I've just told you about the choice between intermediated and direct financing. Okay, so in order to be able to explain the coexistence, we have to introduce something else, which is an amount of collateral. Okay, so this is retained earnings, if you prefer. Okay, collateral, K. Retained earnings. So let's say this is something that the entrepreneur entrepreneur is able to invest in the project he or she wants to realize. Okay, so in case of well, in both cases, actually, the amount, therefore, the amount the entrepreneur wants to borrow, it is no longer capital I, it is capital I minus K. So it is capital I minus K, minus what you can invest in your project, okay? And of course, capital K, can be different from one entrepreneur to another entrepreneur, right? Okay, so let me consider the participation constraint of investors, outside investors, not banks, outside. Well, for them, the project is going to repay R or 0. So PHR should be greater than capital I minus K, which is equivalent to say that R should be higher than R min, which is equals to this. Okay, but you see that R min of K, it is a decreasing function of K. So in other words, the higher K, of course, the lower the repayment to outside investors in case of success of the project. So this is important. I repeat, the higher K, the lower the repayment to outside investors in case of success of the project. Why is it important? Because sorry. So is a decreasing function. So this implies that V minus R min of K, so this is increasing in K. So in other words, if you look at the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur, there is a threshold K such that the H V minus R is equals to plus B. Okay, so for K high enough, the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur is satisfied, and which means that the direct financing is then possible. Okay. So, for instance, example. If K equals 0, then direct financing is impossible. Why? Because, for instance, we have that pH V minus strictly lower than PL V minus I over PL plus B. Okay. But if I don't know K is equal to I divided by 2, then direct financing becomes possible. In the sense that pH V minus E over 2 over pH is just equal to PL V minus E plus B. Okay. So moreover, assume that pH V is greater than capital I plus C. So intermediated financing is possible. So how to explain the coexistence between direct and intermediated financing? Well, firms with K higher than K lower bar they strictly prefer direct financing because once again, it is cheaper. They choose direct financing. But firms with K they choose intermediated financing. Why? Because they don't have any other choice in order to obtain the financing of the project they want to realize. Okay. So now we've got the coexistence between the two. Okay, is that clear for you? No. So, yes. So, yes, of course, with intermediated financing, there is still limited liability. Huh? There is still limited liability. K, let's say it corresponds to the amount of money the entrepreneur can invest in his or her project. Okay. And look. Okay. So look. You see that when I write the participation constraint, so this is the participation constraint of a financial intermediary, let's say the bank. Okay. So it is going to receive V or 0 due to limited liability. So in expectation, the expected repayment to the bank is PHV. And this has to be higher than the initial investment plus the cost of audit. Expected payment to the bank because of the limited liability. That is to say, in the other case, in case of failure, the bank is not going to receive anything. Okay? So the other question was, so if PHV is greater I plus C, then intermediated financing is possible, right? You agree? This is for intermediated financing. What I say is that consider that K is equal to 0. So PHR should be greater than A for the participation constraint of outside investors to be satisfied. So this is equivalent to R higher than but let's say that with this minimal amount, I assume that with this minimal amount, the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur is not satisfied. It is what I consider. If it is satisfied even without any retained earning, it's not interesting, let's say. Okay, so this is the case if PH V minus capital A over PH is lower than PL V minus plus B. Okay, but you see that R min of K is equal to I minus K over PH. So decreases in K. So you see that for the entrepreneur, when K increases, what he is going to receive in case of success increases. Increases. Return in case of failure is still the same. 0. Okay, so you see that, and this is the intuition of the result. This is increasing in K. So you see that for K high enough, maximizing the probability of success the probability of success of the project is going to be the best choice for the entrepreneur. Okay, it is going to be the best choice for the entrepreneur. Enough. And this means that for K high enough, we denoted this amount K lower bar. The incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur is going to be satisfied, and therefore direct financing becomes possible. So entrepreneurs endowed with K higher than K lower bar, they choose direct financing, while endowed with K which belongs to 0, K lower bar, take intermediated financing, which is, by the way, the only possibility in terms of financing for them. So we see that with different levels of what is called retained earning, we have coexistence between direct and intermediated financing. Okay, coexistence between direct and intermediated financing. K bar is the minimal amount such that the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur is satisfied. K lower bar is the minimal amount of, let's say, cash such that the incentive compatibility constraint of the entrepreneur is satisfied. For K low bar, the entrepreneur is okay. The entrepreneur is just indifferent between good behavior and bad behavior. We then assume that he chooses good behavior when just indifferent, right? So yes, there is a precise question, which I don't know. So okay, how? Okay, so defining K lower bar. Good question. So we want to be just equal to PL plus B for K lower bar. Okay, so this is going to be minus B So this gives us the precise value of K lower bar. Okay, answering one of your questions. One of your questions. Okay, so now I think it's done. Huh? Is that clear? For the definition of K lower bar. Okay, great. So I think this part is terminated. Let me just check this out. Comparison, okay. Okay, so you see, this is what I told you. So when K increases, the return for the entrepreneur increases in such a way that for K high enough, the entrepreneur prefers to behave well. So he gets rid of the private benefit because he wants to maximize the probability of success, because in that case, he's going to obtain something high enough to make him to induce him preferring maximizing the probability of success of the project rather than just taking the private benefit. So this is why we can say that the higher K, the lower the repayment in case of success to outside investors. And therefore, it becomes in some extent more costly for the entrepreneur to behave badly. Because what is going or she is going to obtain in case of success increases when K increases. So the higher K, the more the entrepreneur faces incentives to behave well, which is going to allow him or her to obtain outside direct financing. And the conclusion is about coexistence between direct financing for those who can obtain direct financing. So they strictly prefer direct finance because it is cheaper. And the other ones who don't have the choice and only take the, let's say, the remaining possible financing, which is intermediated financing. Okay, so good news, part 2 about theories of financial intermediation. So this part is finished. Okay, so we're gonna make exercises, not necessarily today, but maybe tomorrow. So far, do you have questions? Other questions? No? Really? No other questions? So I told you in the final exam, most of the time there are two exercise type questions, but we're going to do exercises in order to show you how it is. And what I do usually is that I also send extra material to the students, that is exercises with corrected exercises. Okay, if you want to make more exercises about this course. Okay, other questions? No other questions? No? Okay, so I think it's best to make a break. 20 minutes break. You agree? 20-25 minutes break. You agree with that? Yes? Okay, so let's do that. See you in 20-25 minutes. Okay? See you. Okay. I think it's time to close the break, let's say, and to go back to lecture for a little bit more than 1 hour. Okay, great. Is everything okay? Are you feeling all right? All right. Yes. It's not too hard to work on Sunday. No. Definitely, I prefer to see students and to talk to them a little bit, or even not only a little bit. Okay. So now we're going to start with this part of the course about failures and banking regulation. And of course, this is something really important and very practical for two reasons. First, because now everybody knows that there is a risk of failure for banks. I mean, before the subprime mortgage crisis, well, there were people thinking that a collapse of the banking system was not possible, at least for developed countries. But then the subprime mortgage crisis happened. And now I think that everybody is well aware of the fact that even in well-developed countries, the failure of the banking system is unfortunately possible. And this is also why this, let's say, industrial sector is so regulated. Okay, because in terms of negative externalities, if the banking system fails, well, the negative externalities are huge because, of course, the banking system is at the heart of the financing of an entire economy. And this is why governments prefer to intervene in this very particular market, even in very liberal countries. Okay. So this is what we're going to talk about now. Okay. So let me introduce this topic, and I'm going to introduce the topic of fair banking regulation by talking a little bit about previous crises, and not only the subprime mortgage huge crisis, worldwide crisis. So historically, for instance, in the US, there were every 20 years bank runs. So now we are well aware of what a bank run is, but this was something quite cyclical in the US before the introduction of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is the first huge act about banking regulation in the US. So historically, there has been several important bank runs in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. So approximately every 20 years, there were bank runs, important bank runs. Why? So there is something which is crucial and which is called deposit or depository insurance system. So before the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, there was not a deposit insurance system, which is called the Federal Deposit Insurance Association, system. Sorry, system. So the last one is not I think Federal Deposit Insurance System or Association, well, whatever. But before 1933, there was no deposit insurance system. So in case of a bank failure, depositors had to wait until the bank liquidation before obtaining often only part of their deposit. Okay, so moreover, there was a lack of information, I mean, for the depositors about the quality of the bank's assets, and therefore this led to panic movements of depositors, even against solvable banks, which is a big issue, even against solvable banks. And the problem is that by nature, there is a natural fragility of banks. We talked already about that, due to the role of maturity transformation of banks. So you remember short-term debt deposits. And there is a mismatch between how the bank is financed by using short-term financial instruments, so deposits, and credits in the asset side of the bank balance sheet. Okay, so if there is a panic movement, even a solvable bank is not able to withstand this panic movement. And therefore, there was a question about the solidity of the banking sector as a whole. Okay, problem systemic risk. So you have to differentiate between idiosyncratic risk, for instance, affecting only one or few banks, and systemic macro risk affecting the entire banking system. Okay. And so once again, I show you the picture because I've got one picture, that one, in England in 2007 or 2008. This is typically people waiting to withdraw money, panic. So people rush to the bank in order to withdraw money. The fear, because they fear not to be repaid on their deposits. But in that case, even a solvable bank goes to bankruptcy most of the time due to the mismatch between short-term debt on the liability side, deposits, and long-term assets, that is long-term assets, that is credit, granted credits. Okay, so this is the role of maturity transformation. Of banks, which implies this mismatch. Okay, you agree with that? Is that clear? So we talked already about bank runs yesterday. So you told me that there was in the past years in Vietnam a problem of bank runs. But by the way, are Vietnamese people protected by insurance deposits in Vietnam? Are you protected by this kind of insurance? So in other words, if the bank fails, are you going to be always paid? Okay, I see. We paid by the central bank or an insurance system. So I see. So if I understand well, it exists, but it is limited. Am I correct? Am I correct? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So you see, after the introduction of, after the Glass-Steagall Act, and the introduction of a federal deposit insurance system, well, this question of panic movement was resolved. So the introduction of the federal deposit insurance system allowed to avoid panic movement and bank runs in the US. So it was clearly a success, and this is why more or less worldwide every country adopted a system of deposit insurance. So if you look at the number of banks failures in the US in time, so this is time, you see that, let's say, since just after the adoption of the Glass-Steagall Act up to the 80s, the number of failure was quite low. Then a new problem, very important problem in the 80s, which is called the saving and loans banking crisis in the 80s. We are going to talk about that later. And of course, the World Championship crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis from 2007 to 2010. But I'm going to talk about that later. I also going to talk about that later, of course. Okay, so between the adoption of the Glass-Steagall Act and the 80s, important diminution of banking failures. However, new problem in the 80s with this is the saving, once again, saving and loans banks. So it is a particular kind of banks in the US. This is not investment banks. So nothing to compare with Goldman Sachs, for instance. This is quite, very quiet banks most of the time, but not in the 80s. In France, it is called caisse d'épargne. So it's rather deposit banks. So the number of failures, both for commercial banks and for saving and loans companies, has been more than 10 times higher than during previous decades. So why was it the case? Well, more competition on the traditional activity of lending, which is going to decrease the profitability of banks on this activity. Therefore, development of riskier activities so as to increase profits, investment in commercial real estate, LBOs, leverage buyout, trading activities, risky investments, which is called investing in junk bonds. So there are two. So if you consider a system of so let us consider a system of deposit insurance. There are two aspects. First, there is, of course, a good aspect associated with a system of deposit insurance. So there is no longer any panic movement. So no longer any bank run. So this is good news. But there is also, let's say, a bad aspect. Why? Because depositors, because they know that whatever is going to happen, they are going to be repaid entirely. So they don't have any incentive to control or to look at the activity of the bank. Depositor, let's say, no longer monitor. They no longer monitor what the bank is doing. And this could lead to an excessive risk-taking behavior by the bank. And this is precisely what happened during this crisis, which is named the saving and loans crisis in the US. Okay, let me say a few words about this notion of excessive risk-taking behavior. Why? Because there is a huge distinction between taking risk, which is usual for a bank. Every day a bank is taking risk. This is usual business for a bank, right? We talked already about that. You know, maturity transformation, quality transformation, liquidity risk, credit risk, and so on and so forth. So this is at the heart of the banking activity, or let's say financial intermediaries activity. But this is not what I am talking here. I'm talking about excessive risk-taking behavior. It's not at all the same. So I repeat, it's normal for a bank or for a financial intermediary to take risk. Okay, so for instance, you know that something which could be seen as risky for one individual is not risky for a bank by applying something like the law of large number. Okay, but here I'm not talking about taking kind of normal risk for a bank. That is not what I'm talking about. In that case, I'm talking about excessive risk taking, right? It's not the same. So this is, in some extent, excessive risk-taking behavior. Is that clear? Is that clear for you? So there are questions. Okay, so there are good questions about the limit. You are right. It is very important to talk about the limit of insurance deposit insurance. Yes, the last question is precisely what I think. Yes, because there is no longer this question of monitoring by depositors. So what you have to understand is that monitoring by depositors is kind of a threat for a bank, because if you see that the bank in which you have your money is taking too much risk, then you withdraw money and you put your money in another bank. So this is called market discipline. But if, as a depositor, I am 100% insured, I don't care, because exerting a monitoring activity is always costly, at least because it takes time. Okay? So if you know that you are going to be perfectly repaid, then you no longer exert this monitoring control, and therefore, if a bank is no longer controlled, well, there are many examples which show that in that case, bank CEOs are going to take more risk, much more risk. Okay. So about the limits associated with insurance deposit, this is a very good question. I'm going to give you an answer, which okay. Let me give you the following answer. So, for instance, it is the same in Europe, in the euro area. So, let me consider the euro area. So, in the euro area, there is an upper limit of deposit insurance. But, because there is a but everybody thinks that in case of problem, I mean, if the bank is close to bankruptcy, the European regulator or government or European Central Bank is going to intervene in order to rescue the bank, right? So, in other words, even if there is an upper limit, everybody thinks that there is actually no limit on the depository insurance. Okay. So about the US, there is a small difference. You know why? Why? Because there is one example of bank which was not rescued. Which one? What do you think? Which one? You know that. Everybody knows that. So necessarily you know that. Precisely. Lehman Brothers. That's right. That's right. But you know, it was a very particular point of time. And in particular, it was just after the rescue of AIG. But, well, yes, AIG, right. Just after the rescue of AIG. But anyway, let's say that even in the US, the limit is quite high. So for most of the people, it is like having to be sure to be repaid, 100% insured, right? So this is to show you the banking crisis in the world since 1970 without taking into account the subprime mortgage worldwide crisis. Okay, so this is actually between 1970 and 2007. And what is nice in this graph is to make a distinction between what is called systemic banking crisis and non-systemic banking crisis. So a systemic banking crisis, sorry, this is in French. Crisis is a crisis which affects the entire banking system of a country. So this is a huge crisis, very important crisis. And a non-systemic crisis, banking crisis, is a crisis which does not affect the entire, which, let's say, in other words, which only affects some banks, but not the entire banking system. So the entire banking system is not affected in the case of a non-systemic banking crisis. So if you look at countries, you can observe that except some particular country like Greenland, in which nobody is living, most of the countries worldwide suffered from banking crisis, which were more or less severe, but crisis. Okay, somewhere you should have Vietnam, and there you have France, for instance. Okay, but this was before the subprime mortgage crisis. Why? Because in that case, you know, it is the world champion in terms of crisis. Why? Because when we consider one huge difference when we talk about the subprime mortgage crisis, is that this is not only a systemic crisis for a single country, even a huge country, even a large, let's say, country like the US, it's much more than this. It is kind of a systemic crisis for the entire world. Okay, so worldwide systemic crisis. So it affected Europe, it affected most of the South America, Latin America, and it affected also Asia and Africa. So in that case, it was a worldwide systemic crisis. Okay, very dramatic. So this is also quite important. So this is to give you idea about the cost of a banking crisis. So the idea is, what is the cost of a banking crisis for a country? Because it's impossible for a country to live, let's say, without a banking system. So, for instance, consider the car industry. Well, you know, there are many countries in which there are no car producers. It's not a problem. Even big countries, okay, it's not really a problem. But there is no country with no banking system. It's just impossible, because once again, banks, financial intermediaries are at the heart of financing an economy. So it's not possible for a country to exist without a banking system, even a centralized banking system. I mean, even if banks are public banks, but you always have banks, either private or public, but always banks. So in this column, you have the period of time during which there was a banking system. Okay, so in this column, you have the names of the countries. And so once again, this is without taking into account the previous subprime mortgage crisis. And so here you have an indication about the cost of a banking crisis. But how to measure the cost of a banking crisis? Well, the first measure would be to say an amount in whatever currency. Okay, but you know, it is always complicated to compare amounts, because how to compare an amount for a small or a large country? So it's not the measure which is taken into account here. The measure which is taken into account here is in terms of the percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. Okay, so it is the percentage of the gross domestic product. And if you look, for instance, at the case of Argentina, you end up with a number which is more than half of the of 1 year GDP. So it is really huge. It is amazingly huge. So the cost of a banking crisis can be amazingly huge for countries, even large countries like Argentina. Okay. And if you don't trust me, you can look at the article. This is a reference of the article. Okay, managing the real and fiscal effects of bank crisis. Okay, so far, do you have questions? Is that clear? So I don't know about the previous question. So maybe you've got some answers. So about ASEAN crisis, there you've got Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, Malaysia. That's all. Okay, so quite huge costs. Okay. Is that clear? Is that clear for you? Let me know. It has to be. So if it's not, it's time to tell me. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great. So now we are going to talk about, so after this introduction, this short introduction, the purpose of this short introduction was to convince you that a banking crisis can be really costly for a firm. And I'm pretty sure that everybody now, even before, but now everybody is convinced that a banking crisis can be very costly for a country. Okay, so now we're going to talk about banking regulation. So why is there a banking regulation? So that is the question we want to look at. So why is there banking regulation more or less throughout the world, in every country in the world? So the first goal is protecting depositors, protecting each of us, deposits of each of us. Second objective, guaranteeing the security and the solidity of the money. So if you look at Argentina, this is typically a problem of inflation, huge inflation. Okay, so when there is a huge inflation, it is really costly because sorry, there is no longer any trust in the national currency. Okay, sorry, there is no longer any trust in the national inflation. Okay, and this is really costly for a country. Excuse me, just 1 second. Excuse me. So there is no longer any trust in the national currency, and this is a real problem because then people are obliged to convert national currency in another international currency like euros, dollar, or whatever. And so for the government, it is a disaster. Okay, because everything that the government wants to do has no value, almost no value. So guaranteeing the security and the solidity of the money, preventing systemic banking crisis, because else huge negative externality due to a lack of financing for the economy. And fourth, and the last but not the least, preserving the economy system of financing. Well, the two, actually, number 3 and number 4 are interrelated. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the instruments of banking regulation. So first, there is one we talked already about, which is deposit insurance. Okay, so this is to avoid bank runs, panic movement. And there is another one which is very famous and that we are going to talk a lot. It is capital requirements. So this is the McDermott ratio or the Cook ratio. So this is capital solvency ratio. And so I'm going to go into the details of this because it's important to understand why the regulator is asking for a minimum level of capital. But I'm going to talk about that later. Yeah. I will explain to you what is the meaning of having capital requirement is the meaning of capital requirement is to say that the regulator asks the bank to have a minimal level of capital, basically equity of capital, equity, compare to the level of assets. Most of the time it is 8% of the assets. Okay. And for those of you who are familiar with the notion of economic capital, are you familiar with this notion of economic capital? Yes? Economic. Are you familiar with that? Are you familiar with this notion of economic capital? Yes or not? Okay, so economic capital is a notion of risk management. Okay, so the idea is to say that if you have too much debt, the problem is not being able to repay debt because you don't have the choice. This is a contract. This is a financial contract. And you know that returns from assets are randomly distributed. You are never 100% sure to obtain a repayment associated to your assets. Okay, the return on assets are more or less, but are randomly distributed. Okay, so if you have too much debt, there are cases in which firm is not going to be able to to pay its debt. So the firm in that situation is going to bankruptcy. How can a firm avoid this situation? Well, one answer is using equity rather than debt. Why? Very easy. Because if a firm does not pay dividend, it does not go to bankruptcy. Well, of course, equity holders are not going to be happy with that. But the firm is not liquidated. But if firm does not serve its debt, interest goes to bankruptcy. Okay. So the idea of the economic capital is for a firm to choose a sufficient level of equity financing in such a way to be able to resist against problem, let's say. Okay. And this is a choice of a firm. But what is particular for a bank is that there is a minimum level of equity, let's say of capital, which is obliged by the regulator, which is not the case for other industrial sectors. Okay. But the idea which is behind imposing a level of minimum capital to the banks is precisely to develop a kind of shield for banks to resist shocks. Okay. Okay. Yes, precisely. But about I'm going to talk about that later. But you're right. There is a good answer about the economic capital. I agree with that. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so another possibility is directly to limit risk. So this was one idea of the Glass-Steagall Act, because I told you that since 1933 to 1999, universal banking, for instance, was forbidden in the US. So the idea was to limit risk and to divide, let's say, deposit banks from commercial banks, from investment banks. in order to limit actually the risk for depositors. It was to limit, to protect the depositors. So remember, protecting depositors. Okay. So number D, banking supervision. First agreement. So that is to say, if you want to open a bank, well, it's not possible per se. You have to ask for an authorization. So this is called agreement. And then once you obtain the agreement, there are controls, internal evaluation of risks, and public disclosure of information. So this is actually related to deposit insurance. So because of deposit insurance, we know that depositors are less willing to look for information about what a bank is doing, for information about how a bank is run, monitoring, less monitoring, right? To look for information. So the question is how to restore market discipline. Market discipline. Well, by obliging banks to disclose information about their activities, by obliging banks to disclose information about their activities. So in other words, about the risk they take. Okay. And for instance, this is what is called the pillar 3. I don't know if there is 1 or 2L. Pillar 3 of Basel II agreement. Basel 2. Of Basel II agreement. Okay. So deposit insurance, we talked already a lot about that. I hope that now it's clear for you. So the idea of the observation was that banks are fragile. They are vulnerable to panics of depositors that fear not to be fully reimbursed in case of failure, because there is this rule of first come, first repaid. And the problem is that, well, if it is a way to shut down, to close insolvable banks, it's not a problem. This is life, okay? If you are not good, well, you go to bankruptcy. This is normal, okay? This is market discipline. But the problem, that is really what you have to understand, is that the problem with bank runs, due to the maturity transformation activity role of banks, is that it affects also solvable banks, and that is the problem. That is a problem. So this is the problem of bank runs. Okay. A deposit insurance system allows avoiding contagious bank runs, since depositors know that even if their bank fails, they will recover their deposits. So it is, as we said already, the creation following, so this is following the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, and the creation of what is called the FDIC, for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We talked about the Federal Deposit Insurance System, but the Federal Deposit Insurance System goes through the creation of the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay, so the system in Europe was a little bit different, because up to, well, it depends on countries. But for instance, if we consider France, well, the creation of a deposit insurance system is quite recent, because it is only since 1994. Why? Because previously the system was a system of lender of last resort, which is basically equivalent. And the role of the lender of last resort was played by the central bank, of course. The central bank. And in some countries in Europe, it was only replaced by an insurance, a deposit insurance system, quite late, in 1994, for instance. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to, well, we talked already about that. There are, so the good point of a deposit insurance system, the good aspect of deposit insurance system, it avoids bank runs. And remember that bank runs are not good because they oblige solvable banks to fail. That's the problem of bank runs, once again, that also solvable banks can fail. But there are also negative aspects associated with creating a deposit insurance system. Is that first, it leads to moral hazard. That is, banks CEO can then engage in excessive risk-taking behavior. Okay, so once again, not forget excessive risk-taking. Okay, because it's normal to take risks for a bank, once again. There we're talking about excessive risk-taking, like investing in junk bonds, for instance. And moreover, there is also an adverse selection problem, because think about people who are risk lover. Well, if they know that in the banking activity they will be able to take risk, they are induced, they are willing to work in a bank. And this is going to exacerbate the moral hazard and the excessive risk-taking behavior. This is going to exacerbate the risk to exacerbate the excessive risk-taking behavior. The excessive taking behavior. Okay. So there are pros and cons associated with a deposit insurance, adopting a deposit insurance system. But actually, it is more or less adopted worldwide, because the good aspect seems to dominate the negative aspects, and moreover, there are other ways to resolve negative aspects, and this is what we're going to see tomorrow. So I think that it's time to stop. So if you don't have any more questions, I think we are going to stop now. Is that clear for everybody? No other questions? No? Okay, so I think it's time to stop. So thank you for all of you to follow this lecture today on Easter. And see you tomorrow. Goodbye. See you tomorrow. Goodbye. Goodbye. Yes. Nice weekend to you too. Thank you. Goodbye. Take care and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Goodbye.